Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. I'm Michael Brooks.
Hey guys, Anna Kasparian.
On this week's program, we have Matt Karp, Princeton University scholar, academic, Jacobin contributing writer, and still Bernie bro, to talk about the aftermath of the election, of the primary, and what we're going to do moving forward. Of course, we've got commentaries from both of us, hitting a lot of important topics, and a SALT segment, which I'm looking forward to because I think I have some emerging controversial views on the election. And we're going to do something new that we haven't done before this week, which is we're going to take some questions from the chat at the end. So if you're watching, make sure you hit subscribe to the Jacobin YouTube channel, hit the bell so you get the notifications, and go to the Jacobin's main website and subscribe to the magazine. That's the engine of this whole thing and the way you get indispensable Marxist political intelligence. Anna, how you doing?
I'm doing okay, hanging in there. Just ready. I'm ready for a 3-day weekend. So how are you doing?
I feel you. No, I'm really tired, ready for a break. It's a nice rainy day here in Brooklyn. So after this, hopefully gonna, read an actual book. That is one of the few things that I'm achieving in this quarantine time. I'm doing a little bit more actual book reading and a little bit less tech time. I still want to cut down more, but it's starting with actual physical book reading.
No, I love that. I totally agree with you. I've taken a little bit of a step back from social media, and it gets to a point. I don't know if you've watched, what's the name of that relatively new show on HBO? It has to do with like this legend, this myth called El Cuco, which feeds off of like human misery. Oh, and wow. I'm like, human misery, like that's Twitter. Twitter is El Cuco. Like, it feeds off of your misery. It's just there to upset you. Like, don't get me wrong, it can be used as a tool to get messaging out. But right now, I just feel like it's such a toxic place to be. And if you really want to learn about things, it's not necessarily the best place to go. It's a good aggregate of maybe some news stories, but I totally agree with you. Sitting down, reading long pieces has been way better for me mentally lately than being on social media.
If you can do a little meditating, little exercise, and actually read a physical book, if you have the capacity to do that, that is going to pay big dividends for your mood. And I actually also liked how when I had Dr. Cornel West on TMBS a couple weeks ago, he actually was saying that when you take that time to step out of the constant market pressure, like even though we're only basically wasting time on social media and there's basically no value to it, there's still this idea that like you're accomplishing something just even subconsciously because you're like posting or whatever the hell that means. And he was saying like if you even taking time to read something or engage in a cultural product that has no monetary value, like you can't assign a market value to it, that is like it's a way of stepping out of things in a certain way. And I was inspired by that. I thought that was cool. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to watch a Cheech and Chong movie tonight.
I love it. Yeah, you need it. You need it. You need to just unplug and focus on other things for a little bit and just kind of be clear-headed about your analysis and your takes on things. Like, Twitter is the place where you feel this like unbelievable pressure to have a take. And that's why hot takes exist. And so just take a breather, do a little research, do a little reading for your own enlightenment. And if you have something, a point of view that's actually worth sharing, that isn't like, ginned up last minute because you feel like you're pressured to have a take, then definitely share that view. Like, make sure that there's some actual substance behind it.
Totally. And if you really are at a impasse and you don't know what to think, just check out what me and Anna are saying on our feeds and we got you. Just substitute your thought process for ours.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I'm totally okay with that. Anna, What's cooking? What's on your commentary deck this week? We got to come up with a better phrase for that, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. This is a little different from the commentary that I've provided on this show so far. But and please allow me to indulge in a little bit of venting, because this has been a problem that I've been kind of dealing with, grappling with behind the scenes. And it really has to do with the unbelievably stupid daily news cycle and how journalists on a regular basis get played into unwittingly campaigning for Donald Trump. And nothing made that clearer than the news cycle yesterday, which I'm sure is going to bleed into the news cycle today. So look, Donald Trump, for all of his incompetence, is actually incredibly savvy when it comes to campaigning and marketing. And I think that he continues to be underestimated by members of legacy media, members of mainstream journalism. And nothing made that clearer than the news cycle where journalists focused on Trump's statements regarding forcing governors to open places of worship, even if it's premature, even if it's dangerous. And so it just goes along with this playbook that for some reason journalists haven't been privy to yet, even though it's out there, it's obvious. So Trump will say something stupid, outrageous, or controversial that appeals to the worst characteristics of his base. Then the journalists will be baffled by it, angry about it. The hyperventilating will begin, and they'll dedicate the next 24-hour news cycle to the outrageous thing that Donald Trump has said. Then Trump will complain about how the media is being so unfair to him, and that'll take up more of the news cycle. And then, it's just, again, the media advertising the very characteristics of Donald Trump that appeal to his base. He is campaigning right now. Make no mistake about it. So yesterday, Trump decided to do this press conference, and he was incredibly smart in refusing to take any questions following this press conference. Let's take a look at what he had to say, and then I'm going to break it down for you.
Today, I'm identifying houses of worship, churches, synagogue, and mosques as essential places that provide essential services. Some governors have deemed liquor stores and abortion clinics as essential, but have left out churches and other houses of worship. It's not right. So I'm correcting this injustice and calling houses of worship essential. I call upon governors to allow our churches and places of worship to open right now. If there's any question, they're going to have to call me, but they're not going to be successful in that call.
So Donald Trump has this press conference. It's early in the day, and he was smart in refusing to take any questions afterwards, because that ensured that journalists would cover this story. And then later in the day, the story would continue with the White House press briefing, which Kayleigh McEnany had, right? So without fail, here's what happens later in the day. And already you have the media advertising something that is nothing more than red meat to his base, okay? The evangelical vote absolutely love that. They love the fact that he brought up abortion and liquor stores and how immoral it is to close these places of worship when we have liquor stores open. Now, of course, in a lot of parts in America, liquor stores unfortunately serve as the only place you can go to buy food. They end up serving as, default grocery stores, which is why they're open and considered essential businesses. And we know why abortion clinics also remain open. It's because it's one of the places where women might have to go for essential health care in America. But nonetheless, what Trump did there was campaign. And if you're a smart, savvy journalist, you're going to realize that, and you're not going to feed into it. You're not going to dedicate a 24-hour news cycle to what Trump says, because the fact of the matter is Trump has absolutely no power when it comes to forcing governors to reopen businesses or places of worship. He doesn't have that type of jurisdiction, and I'll get to the details of that in just a minute. But again, without fail, later in the day, Kayleigh McEnany gets asked questions about what type of authority Trump thinks he has in order to force governors to do this. Take a look.
The president said he's going to override the governors. Under what authority would he do that? And to your point, he said several weeks ago, this is all up to the governors.
Well, I think you're posing a hypothetical, and I think we can all hope that we see governors.
Would override the governors.
You're posing a hypothetical, though.
The president said he's going to override the governors.
All right, so here's the thing. How about instead of asking that question to a person who is literally put in that position to lie to you, why don't you just have a conversation with a constitutional scholar, a legal expert, someone who actually has an incentive, some interest in sharing their expertise with you? Obviously, Kayleigh McEnany is none of those things and is put there to lie to the American people. So you don't need to ask that question during that press conference. You could have easily answered that question, first of all, immediately after Trump claimed he was going to override governors, but they didn't, right? They continued campaigning on behalf of Trump without realizing how unbelievably incompetent they are and how they've been tricked into campaigning on behalf of Donald Trump. So what's the truth? The truth is that the Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. So if the federal government were to have any type of say in what happens in local politics, Congress needs to get involved. Donald Trump cannot unilaterally force governors to open businesses or places of worship. End of story, right? The story's over. We don't need to hyperventilate. We don't need to panic. We know what the laws are. And if we don't know what the laws are and we're somehow miraculously working as journalists or White House correspondents, then there's a giant list of legal scholars that you can speak to get that question answered, right? But instead, it just continues on and on and on. And what else does Donald Trump want more than anything? He wants this debate about the importance of religion to rage on, and that also happened during this White House press conference. And look, I understand how ridiculous it is to have a guy who paid hush money payments to porn stars in the lead up to Election Day, talking about the importance of religion, right? It's absolutely ridiculous, but it doesn't matter. This is something that he really does rely on in order to get reelected. And why are these journalists doing the campaigning for him? So here's another example from yesterday's White House press conference.
The president will strongly encourage every governor to allow their churches to reopen. And boy, it's interesting to be in a room that desperately wants to seem to see these churches and houses of worship stay closed.
The president said that he has that.
Kayleigh, I object to that. I mean, I go to church. I'm dying to go back to church. The question that we're asking you and would like to have asked the president and Dr. Brooks is it safe? And if it's not safe, is the president trying to encourage that, or does the president agree with Dr. Brooks that people should wait?
Jeff, it is safe to reopen your churches.
And notice how Kayleigh McEnany didn't have any answers for the incessant questioning regarding Trump's authority. She didn't have any answers because we all know what the truth is. Trump doesn't have that authority. And now we're having a debate about who's more religious, who's more devout. And that's the exact debate that evangelical supporters of Trump's want us to have. And in the meantime, what these journalists are doing is ignoring incredibly important abuses that are happening by the White House. While the White House claims that, oh, well, our religious freedoms are being violated. I grew up religious. I grew up going to Sunday school every single Sunday. And I remember feeling that I don't need to be inside a church to be close to God or to be close to Jesus, right? You can literally pray anywhere. You can pray in a closet. And as long as you are a person of faith and you feel that you have this line of communication to a higher power, then that's all that matters. But all of this nonsense about opening places of worship has nothing to do about violating religious freedoms. This is everything having to do with Trump's reelection campaign. So why are we wasting our time talking about this? Why are they campaigning, again, on behalf of Donald Trump? And by the way, when I talk about the abuses during this pandemic, there was a story that was reported this week by Newsweek. It was a great story, got absolutely no attention. The Trump administration has expanded on the government watch list, and it now includes American citizens with absolutely no probable cause. There's no reasonable suspicion. There's absolutely no indication that any of these people, American citizens on this list, have done anything wrong. And the worst part about it is you won't even be notified that you're being tracked down by the federal government, that they're taking a look at your banking transactions, that they're keeping a close eye on your travel. If you are, let's say, applying for a new job and that job requires you to undergo an extensive background check, the fact that you are on that government watch list will come up in the extensive background check, thus destroying your opportunities in the future and basically screwing with your livelihood. That's a big story. I haven't seen a single journalist ask a question about that. Instead, they waste their time asking Kayleigh freaking McEnany nonsense questions that they can easily have answered by almost anyone. But if you want an expert, go to a legal scholar, go to a constitutional professor, go to someone who actually knows what they're talking about. Don't spend more time like giving air to this nonsense story. And look, I'm not saying all of this because I don't think religion is important. For a lot of Americans, it is important. Faith is what helps them get through difficult times like what we're experiencing today with the pandemic. So this is not to minimize the importance of religion, but it is to reveal what the intentions and the strategy of the Trump administration is. While Trump might seem like he's a complete moron, he is savvy when it comes to campaigning. He is smart when it comes to marketing and messaging, and that's exactly what he's doing now. So how about we focus on the real freedoms that are being violated in America right now, rather than give Trump all of this airtime for nonsense issues that aren't really issues to begin with. That's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I mean, this is so important, and I for one miss going to mosque myself. But I think that there's no doubt that number one, there is an incentive structure for the press with Trump. He's good for ratings, he's good for revenue, and this is the dynamic going back to the primary of, the major cable networks. Obviously, Fox is kind of propaganda arm of the Republican Party, but CNN, MSNBC, we're so appalled. We can't believe he's saying these things. Let's go watch him say these things. And that some of that dynamic, a lot of that dynamic exists through today. And I really, really, really appreciate that you brought up that Newsweek story. And there's also been recent additions to the Patriot Act, which Mitch McConnell muscled through on behalf of Bill Barr, as an example, and about 10 Democrats voted for, that allows the FBI to look at your browsing data as well. And I think this is really, really important because there was this incredible melodrama about Trump. I mean, people actually comparing him literally to Hitler and this sort of stuff, which, again, I think, to a lot of people rightly struck them as, kind of over the top and ridiculous. And at the same time, and we saw these other dynamics even in mainstream media where, like, of course, Trump incites against the press. But the sort of battle between him and Jim Acosta is not these structural erosions that the Trump administration and the Republicans are pushing through with regards to civil liberties. So I think that there's this really toxic dynamic where not only does the media fall for and push all of his tricks that they're going to use to mobilize the base, like this religious reopening thing, but while they're hyperventilating about this stuff, some of which is, important enough. And as you said, you could actually talk to somebody who knows what they're talking about to debunk the obvious lies that the White House is telling. We are not focusing on the areas where there are serious, dangerous threats and erosion to liberties that the Trump administration is seriously pushing, with particularly Bill Barr, who really is a genuinely dangerous character as AG. And, we get into this dynamic where I think there's a little bit of cry wolf with the broader electorate. And, because there's this constant melodrama. But the truth is that this erosion and these threats to liberties are absolutely taking place with, an obscene, corrupt, and totally unaccountable in every way, shape, and form administration.
Yeah, I think that what the media is doing right now with the nonstop outrage is they're causing outrage fatigue. And I feel it, right? Like I'm almost never outraged anymore. And that's a terrifying thing to experience because there are all sorts of outrageous moves by the Trump administration that are completely being ignored. And our civil liberties are being scaled back considerably, but there's almost no coverage on that. So how are you going to expect the average American voter to feel angry, frustrated, outraged about what's happening to their privacy and by the way, how are you going to get them to trust your reporting on how the Trump administration is violating your privacy and your civil liberties when every single day it appears that you're outraged by issues that honestly, when you do a little bit of digging, are non-issues? Again, with this story, Trump cannot unilaterally force governors to open anything in their states. You would need Congress to act, and with Democrats controlling the House, this is just not going to happen, right? So just think about story selection a little more analytically, and don't fall for the same exact tricks that Trump played in the last election cycle and is certainly doing the same strategy now. It's pathetic, it's sad, and I get what you're saying about the ratings. And it's also really lazy journalism. I mean, I know this firsthand. It's a lot harder to produce a story about civil liberties violations and like really digging deep and doing like legal analysis to have like a thoughtful, opinionated, segment on it than to just play a video of Trump saying something stupid and then talk about how outraged you are. Super easy, but that's super lazy, and it doesn't really provide any value to society. And that's, I think, part of the reason why we're here today.
100%. It also has that social media flattening effect, which when you look at people's outrage threads, amongst the centrist corporate types, it's either let's completely ignore when Trump says something that is misdirected but appealing and speaks to something real, like when he was ripping into trade agreements, which have been so bad for so many workers. Then it's like, oh, he said something, I don't know. He said the press correspondence dinner was stupid. Everybody thinks the press correspondence dinner is stupid besides the press. And then on the third thing, he's, tearing up an arms control treaty with Russia, which maybe we don't even want to lean into that much anyways, because 2/3 of the time we're saying he's a KGB agent. So why would we want to talk about, him breaking up the architecture of global arms control in an enormously dangerous way, and in a way that is, of course, the mainstream in Republican foreign policy. I mean, I saw John Bolton the other day, who, these idiots were even cheering him on for a couple of months, praising Trump for pulling out of another arms control treaty. So, it's ridiculous, it's dangerous, and it misses really, really important distinctions we need to make if, again, we actually want to beat Trump. And it's hysterical to keep being in a position where we're Bernie bros, or I'll speak for myself, Bernie bros, who are, want to not only really get rid of Trump, but the causes that led to Trump. And people who have no analytic ability beyond being hysterical about Trump have no analytic ability to beat him.
Yeah, it is pretty incredible. And like the hysteria is, again, advertisement that appeals to Trump's base. It empowers him. So, but anyway,
100%.
Speaking of arms,
no, they're totally feeding him. No, I completely, that's really, really well put. So I want to talk about Trump administration foreign policy and try to introduce a couple of concepts, including primitive or primary accumulation and the commons. Don't worry, I'll try to break it down and make it as direct as possible. So the Trump administration's foreign policy has been getting a little bit of attention recently. As an example that Anna just alluded to, inspector generals are getting fired because they've been looking into, as an example, the overriding of expert advice, even within the intelligence and defense apparatus itself, against selling arms to Saudi Arabia. Arms sales to Saudi Arabia has been a major priority of the Trump administration. And also, even before and carrying through Trump, arms is absolutely one of the United States' biggest and most important exports. And when we look at this foreign policy questions of really what amount to fights for natural resources and conflicts about new markets in the essential materials of life, water, oil, timber, very basic stuff, we can go back to some really important Marxist ideas about how capitalism came into being. And there's a lot of factors here, but today I just want to talk about this idea of primary accumulation and the commons a little bit. And so basically, one of the ways that capitalism came into being, and this isn't just according to Marx, there's a free market tradition of sort of understanding this as well, is when commons, which were open spaces, primarily in the UK, people are talking about in Britain, where people could collect firewood, where they could graze their cows. There was some sense of communal access, even for people who were not necessarily property holders. And what you start doing is you start actually, as part of broader shifts of pushing people to go into emerging city centers to do industrial labor, is you actually start closing these common areas. You start putting stones, fences, and other things around areas that used to be sort of commonly accessible. And the commons, and this is part of how you sort of push people into providing their labor for capital. And the commons as a concept has expanded way out. This is a really big tradition. The person that I read the most on it is the great Marxist economist David Harvey. And let's actually start. We have a quote from him. This is a David Harvey essay on the commons that I'll read from. The cultural and intellectual commons are not often subject to the logic of scarcity and the exclusionary use of the source that apply to natural resources, a point emphasized by Michael Hart and Antonio Negri in Commonwealth. We all listen to the same radio broadcast or television program at the same time. The cultural common, Hart and Negri argue, is a dynamic involving both the product of labor and the means of future productions. This common is not only the earth we share, but also the language we create, the social practices we establish, the models of society that we're in relationship with, and so forth. It's built up over time and in principle open to all. And in this way, it's possible to even view the metropolis as a factory for the production of the commons. And the point here is that this idea of the commons covers a lot of stuff, from oil and other natural resources, but also cultural production and genetics, health. When we look at the future of policy making and business interest in a corona age, we're going to have to look really carefully at how do we make the genetic code, as an example, not be something that's entirely privatized and commodified. One other clip I'll play from a really good show called TMBS, but this is of Professor Richard Wolff. This is it's actually a little awkward to use a clip from one of my other shows, but he does a really good job here again of explaining this process of primitive accumulation, and then we're going to loop it back to some trends in American foreign policy. But this is Richard Wolff.
The accumulation of capital happens in two different ways. Mm-hmm. One way is built into capitalism. It's the capitalist getting as much profit as he can and plowing it back into the business. That's capitalist accumulation. But capital also has to accumulate, in a sense, before we have capitalism to kind of get the ball rolling. You have to have, on the one hand, a bunch of people who have some wealth in their hands and another bunch of people who have nothing. Because then a deal will be struck. Those who have nothing are in danger of dying because they have nothing. Those who have a lot say to themselves, wait a minute, I have a lot, but maybe I can get the one who's scared to die to work for me, producing a profit for me. That way he survives because I pay him wages, and my wealth goes up, which is what I want.
I like the Wolff explainer on things. So how does this dynamic of pushing people into labor markets, privatizing commons fit into U.S. foreign policy? Well, in almost all ways. And this is really, really important for understanding some of the most dangerous hotspots in the world today. I want to play a clip now from Mike Pompeo, who it looks as grotesque as his foreign policy is, giving an address to an Arctic Security Conference in May 7th, 2019, so just about a year ago. This is Pompeo outlining the opportunities that the Trump administration sees from rapid climate changes in the Arctic region.
This is America's moment to stand up as an Arctic nation and for the Arctic's future. Because far from the barren backcountry that many thought it to be in Seward's time, the Arctic is at the forefront of opportunity and abundance. It houses 13% of the world's undiscovered oil, 30% of its undiscovered gas, and an abundance of uranium, rare earth minerals, gold, diamonds, and millions of square miles of untapped resources. Fisheries galore. And its centerpiece, the Arctic Ocean, is rapidly taking on new strategic significance. Offshore resources, which are helping their respective coastal states, are the subject of renewed competition. Steady reductions in sea ice are opening new passageways and new opportunities for trade. This could potentially slash the time it takes to travel between Asia and the West by as much as 20 days. Arctic sea lanes could come the 21st century Suez and Panama canals. And that leads me to my second point. The second point is this: to leverage the Arctic continental, all nations, including non-Arctic nations, should have a right to engage peacefully in this region. The United States is a believer in free markets. We know from experience that free and fair competition, open by the rule of law, produces the best outcomes. But all the parties in the marketplace have to play by those same rules.
So, and I'm sorry, obviously, Mike Pompeo saying fisheries galore needs to be some type of terrifying sound drop. But we can see here that not only do they not see climate change and the acceleration of the climate threat as a problem, they see it as an enormous primary or primitive accumulation opportunity. And it is. There is a huge amount of money to be made. And we all know that the effects of ecological catastrophe are going to be disproportionately felt, primarily in the developing world. There's big market opportunities for securitizing in a post-accelerated climate change world as well, so that the effects are felt differently. They're envisioning a children of men security scenario while they make money and primary profits off of all of the new natural resources that are yielded by the climate crisis. So I think we need to think much more seriously about the commons, because the commons can actually be a framework that, if you think of defending these resources that are not necessarily in the market or under government control, but form complex webs of natural inheritances, both ecological, biological, our broad base of cultural practices and other areas that were not created by any market or any institution or person, but in fact are common and should not be governed by any particular hegemonic logic. And they're certainly thinking about these resources and how to best utilize them for their own ends. So we should be thinking about that as well. I apologize for the clip of Mike Pompeo talking about fisheries. That really is just nasty. But I hope that yeah.
No, I love that though. I love how you provided a theoretical framework behind what motivates and drives U.S. imperialism and the foreign policy that we're seeing, not just with this administration, but with many administrations, including the Obama administration. Definitely. And you see it manifest in, solidifying capital, but you also see how it negatively impacts the average person. I mean, what we see in Flint with the water crisis, for instance, and how corporate power plays a role in some of the decisions that are made, and how those decisions then get filtered into whether we get clean drinking water, unsafe drinking water. And I love that you brought up the climate change angle, because you're absolutely right. While we see these types of policies for what they are, short-sightedness and absolutely destructive to the environment and to humanity, they do see this as a profitable opportunity and another way in which they can use imperialism to, again, further solidify capital. And so we need to understand like what motivates them, what kind of theoretical framework is at play behind the scenes. And I think the work that Marx did with primary accumulation is really, really important. And we need to ask ourselves, like, are we okay with these people in positions of power getting to decide what to do with the commons, the essentials of life? I mean, I think we've kind of given up and just assume that they have the authority and they can do it. But I think if we're motivated to fight back strategically, we can change that.
Absolutely. And it's also just such a good reframing issue in a way, because it doesn't let you go down this rabbit hole of all of these silly conversations and myths about where markets come from and innovation and all this bullshit. I mean, these primary areas that still produce the system we're in and still are like the necessities for running an industrial economy, which we're still in, no matter how many technological trinkets we get. We're still running off of industrial fuels. We're still competing over extremely basic resources. And water, air, oil, minerals, timber, these are common assets. I mean, there's no other way of even conceptualizing where they come from. And so, you know, the main trends in foreign policy and business competition is over trying to generate monopolies over things that emerge organically. And there's no reason that they can't be governed democratically in a way that benefits a lot more people. And there's also this has nothing to do, you know, with some type of secret genius that Exxon has. I mean, look, they're, you know, brilliant at exploring for energy and they employ great minds and think very strategically, but why? What underlying framework gives them the right, or any other, you know, oil monopoly in this instance, the right to control that common resource? And then, of course, in a way that does enormous damage to most living systems and to most people. So we really need to rethink these things at their base.
Definitely. And, you know, I also, you know, hope that people are thinking about, you know, these issues when analyzing and considering the motivations behind, let's say, the US-led coup in Bolivia. Definitely. What type of natural resources are in Bolivia? Because it's always funny to me to hear Americans talk about violations to democracy as excuses for invading other countries and orchestrating coups, when like we clearly have our own issues with our so-called democratic process. It's not about spreading democracy. It's not about protecting the people of Bolivia. Dig a little deeper. What does Bolivia have that, capitalists want, but see, the leader of Bolivia as a huge obstacle to, and that's lithium. You know, you think about those things and what motivates and drives our foreign policy. I think most people are now privy to the fact that the U.S. really has no interest in spreading democracy. That was all a farce to begin with. But we need to, and you talk about this all the time, think about our movement in a much more global perspective, because it's not just about the United States and doing what's best for the people who live in this country. It's also about thinking about what our government does on a global level to further solidify the system of capitalism that has not done all the great things that we've been conditioned to think it has done.
Fisheries galore.
Yeah.
That guy
can't stop thinking about the fish.
Looks like a Viet Cong sketch of like a man pig generated to like execute. He was like built in like a Koch brothers corn syrup factory.
It's funny that you
So
mentioned
disgusting.
that, and I think about this privately a lot. Trump is a very shallow person. Like, he didn't want John Bolton to serve in his administration initially because he thought John Bolton was ugly and didn't like his mustache. And I'm like, I wonder how Pompeo got through. Like, what did Pompeo do to like pull a fast one over Trump? Because like Pompeo's not a looker.
And Bill
maybe
Barr.
it's just and Bill Barr. Good point. Yeah, looks like a Muppet.
Right.
Yeah.
We're on the FBI list now. So
I'm sure we've been on it.
Yeah, we probably. I don't know. I think it's just probably by being the right combination of like obsequious, but also like these are dirty. I mean, the reason I also just as personalities think about Barr and Pompeo is that these are dirty, dangerous motherfuckers. Like these are the people. There are people in the administration. These are not dumb guys. They know what they're doing. They have a very, very, very extreme ideologies, and they're quite capable of pursuing these things. So, I think they're more on that Mitch McConnell continuum of the actual people in the Republican Party that I think people should be worrying more and more about. There is that part of the Trump world that's funny where it's like, oh, like the assistant, Secretary of State or whatever used to like sell colloidal silver on YouTube. Isn't that funny? But these guys they're real players and they fit. And again, contrary to the resistance nonsense, this is the Republican Party. This is not, oh man, Trump is so bad. But anyways, we got to take a break and we are going to come back with he is the chair of Bernie Bro studies at Princeton University. It's an interesting title. Wonder how they pulled that off. We'll be right back, guys.
What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Weekends with Anna and Michael. Joining us now is Matt Karp, an associate professor of history at Princeton University and a Jacobin contributing editor. He's also the author of The Vast Southern Empire, Slaveholders at the Helm of American Foreign Policy. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Hey, happy to be here.
So I thought we'd start off with a little bit of a postmortem regarding the Democratic primaries. We still have those discussions. I think it's still important and relevant. And I wanted to get your take. How did this all go down? What's your analysis?
Yeah, there's a lot. First, I just want to say, caught the opening segment, and I did grandly announced that I was quitting Twitter today, earlier this month, and I haven't read nearly as many books as I had intended to read since leaving Twitter behind, in part because I'm buried in more discourse nonsense trying to unpack what happened at the Sanders campaign, and not even on top of the discourse nonsense and all of the various takes from left, right, and center on Bernie's on why Bernie 2020 failed. I for some reason obsessively have convinced myself that the answer lies in like precinct electoral results in a variety of different, from Western Massachusetts to Northern Michigan to the Chapel Hill suburbs. If I just read enough of these, if we just dig deep enough into these records, then all will be clear, and the kind of Fairfaxification of the Democratic Party and the triumph of the professional, managerial class will be, written in the stars in a way that it will be so unmistakable that no one can possibly miss it. If I just get enough data into this spreadsheet. But okay, that might be a little into the weeds, but that's where I've been. So I'm trying to find the sky here from the bottom of the ground. Yeah, I mean, what happened with Bernie is he was counting on, as I think a lot of people have said, and this isn't new, he was counting on the kind of indefinite division of his opponents. I think we all were. There was good reason for us to count on that in some ways. There was no historic precedent for what happened, the consolidation of the entire party virtually around one figure in the span of a week, especially when other candidates had, won, quote unquote, won Iowa and so on. Nothing like that happened. Even when Jesse Jackson ran in 1988 and scared everyone by winning the Michigan caucuses, right? And the party went into stop Jesse mode. There's still a split field because Al Gore still thought he was going to be the guy. And Paul Simon still thought he was going to be the guy. And Dick Gebhardt still thought he was going to be the guy. So in some ways, one thing that we've learned from the Bernie campaign is the way that Buttigieg, Klobuchar, and then only half second later, Mike Bloomberg all got out of the race and threw themselves behind Biden, that the Democratic Party actually, in a perverse way, has more power over its sort of functionaries, possibly than ever before. There's no parallel to the kind of unity of this party, in my view, in Democratic Party history, going back, across the sort of 50-year neoliberal era. Ted Kennedy challenged Jimmy Carter from the left, and he wasn't shunned. There was a real civil war there. Bernie prompted the most coordinated and sort of most well-organized and impressively rapid consolidation that we've seen in primary history. Now, that's one take. That's the kind of sour grapes take. The deeper challenge is it's clear that, okay, we don't have the politicians, but we don't have the voters. There's not a just existing social democratic majority within the Democratic Party coalition right now. And simply enunciating universal public demands like healthcare, childcare, jobs, education, you can awaken millions to your side. We learned that from Bernie. We didn't know that before. Now we know it. That's wonderful. But simply enunciating it and running a presidential campaign around it is not enough right now to actually win a majority within the Democratic Party. We've learned that, and that's the hard lesson that we've got to wrestle with, is how to get we've gotten from irrelevance to relevance, but it's a long journey from relevance to power, and that's kind of the dilemma that we're in right now.
Yeah, I think you outlined that really well. What's interesting to me, though, is, and these are themes I guess I've hit a lot, but one was really the recognition that this race was really always about Biden and Bernie. Yes, there was the consolidation. Yes, there was some other kind of fluke factors, but most of the race until the very, very end, or end of the new beginning, when Biden actually started to falter, he led in most polls. And Bernie actually started pretty strong, then he dipped, then he spiked up again, and usually stayed in his kind of range. And when we think about moving forward, this does kind of go back to the misdirection and the distraction with the whole Warren thing, and recognizing that Warren represents actually a very small amount of the electorate. But that, I guess, the bigger question then is does this social democratic constituency grow out through what the kind of standard view that you still hear a lot of people say, which is that, hey, look at the numbers. Even the professional managerial class who votes Democratic, they're increasingly open to things like single payer. So you got to just keep trying to appeal to them, even though their sort of premier candidate did very poorly. Or on the other hand, this idea that I guess I'm obviously pretty partial to, that if most people who were voting for Biden were voting for either just raw electability, this just had nothing to do with ideology at all, but they might actually be open to some version of, let's just say, like New Deal politics, if you could wrap it and frame it in a way that is, less subcultural, probably doesn't use certain terminologies as much, and is more kind of mass appeal. And I think this kind of goes into big questions for us too, moving forward. Like, is there more to learn from how someone like Sherrod Brown becomes a senator from the state of Ohio versus, you know, how somebody takes a blue district and makes it a little bit more progressive? I mean, I want both of those things to happen, but I think a lot of energy is put into maybe relatively narrow fights, not bigger structural things.
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree with that take in terms of why did Biden sort of emerge as the candidate that it was this is an election dominated by the specter of Trump, you know, for the media and for voters too. I think polls show a kind of a historic proportion of Democratic Party voters were thinking almost entirely about who's the guy to beat Trump. I mean, that sort of happens with every incumbent election, and that's a major difference between 2020 and 2016 that I think some of the takes haven't really, you know, acknowledged. The way in which this was a different challenge for Bernie running against an incumbent versus running in the kind of, you know, clear air of the post-Obama era. Everybody was thinking about Trump, and not just the kind of, you know, Russiagate, you know, hysterics or resistance liberals who, you know, we've all indulged in, you know, some you know, gentle ribbing of, but actually I think a lot of, you know, so-called normie, middle class, working class, lower middle class voters you know, black, white, and otherwise, who clearly, you know, were not, so whatever. I mean, they were not voting. A vote for Biden is not a vote against Medicare for all, I don't believe. So in that sense, there is a social democratic majority, and it needs to be awakened. What I meant earlier was simply having that collection of preferences that I think, you know, the exit polls clearly show that Bernie's agenda is the dominant agenda from the perspective of Democratic Party voters and the nation as a whole. Of course, that's not good enough, and there are always going to be various other kind of political logics, whether it's electability, fear of Republican backlash, whether it's you know, fear of gridlock, other kinds of considerations that, you know, maybe justifiably, but you know, they'll always be there. So we can't sort of say, oh, well, this was just this particular set of circumstances, and we definitely have the majority next time. This clearly turning this kind of paper majority into actual power is a project that needs a lot of work. And yeah, I mean, I think thinking through the class dimensions of that is sort of where I'm putting most of my energy right now, because this coalition, the good news is we know that there is this kind of numerical support for these ideas. The bad news is the Democratic Party just keeps getting more, its working class wing keeps shrinking and getting less active. And you look at that in the primary results. You look at turnout in working class and low income black and white precincts, whether it's you know, working class middle towns in Massachusetts, or whether it's, you know, black wards in Flint, Michigan, turnout drops. Not just raw turnout because there are fewer people or the communities have been decimated, but percentage of registered voters. Fewer people are actually participating in this process, and that's in a moment when, broadly speaking, turnout is up. The country's politicized, but the working class is not. And this is you could say it's a failure for Sanders. I don't see it that way, because I think it was always only Bernie's opponents thought that he was going to sort of, you know, raise his you know, his arms like Night King and bring up an invincible army of socialists from the hinterland. This is always part of a long struggle to kind of mobilize and organize a demobilized and disorganized working class. And but it's true, Bernie did not raise working class turnout in a lot of these areas. Neither did Biden. Biden won because he flipped some working class voters who were concerned with electability, and overwhelmingly, though, because Bernie flipped other working class voters, mostly Latinos and younger voters, that he didn't have last time. So I think in working class votes, it was basically a wash from 16. Biden won by larger margins than 20 because the sheer number of voters in the kind of, you could call it professional class, you could call it suburban, you know, just in rich neighborhoods, turnout in Northern Virginia, in, you know, Research Triangle, North Carolina, in Houston, in wealthy kind of energy district neighborhoods around Houston. it just went up shockingly high. Huge numbers of people who were, I think, basically you could call them never Trump Democrats, have entered the party. I mean, we mock never Trump Republicans. That's an op-ed page, that with more writers than there are readers. But it turns out that's not true. All the readers are Democrats now. And the never Trump Democrats are a real fat force, not just in terms of their professional connections and their, social and financial capital, but there are actually a lot of them who have moved from Republicans. 2018 has helped this, and they've numerically changed the Democratic Party coalition. This is the fastest growing, most active part of the coalition. And it's not even just Elizabeth Warren voters. I mean, these places didn't go for Warren. They went for Biden. Some of them went for Bloomberg a little bit, but mostly they went for Biden. And they're part of the Democratic coalition now. And it's going to be hard to imagine getting more Sherrod Browns into that coalition when actually all these new voters, these new energized, highly resourced voters, they don't want Elizabeth Warren. They definitely don't want Sherrod Brown. They definitely don't want Bernie Sanders. They want, they want something like Lizzie Panel Fletcher, who is the kind of, or Alyssa Slotkin, these like class of 2018, security state people who made it into Congress, and orthopedic surgeons, and so on. What I call Republicans. They're a big part of the party now. So anyway, all right. Sorry if that's too long.
So to follow up on that, I'm curious how much of a role you think media, plays a role in the outcome of the primaries, because when you look at polling, I mean, issue by issue, what was being proposed by Bernie Sanders was without question popular. And then you get to this question of electability, and there's a disconnect, because you would assume that the individual who has the popular policy proposals is the most electable, right? Especially because Bernie's policy proposals weren't just, appealing to Democratic voters. They were also appealing to some of the working class white voters who felt like they were left behind by the Obama administration. And they found Trump's, obviously hollow talking points about looking out for the working class appealing. So like, what happened? Like, where is that disconnect where these very people who say that they like Bernie's policies ended up folding and voting for Biden at the end of the day? Does corporate media play a role, especially when you consider some of the fear mongering that took place during the primaries? All of this nonsense about how, Bernie wants an armed revolution, which of course he didn't want an armed revolution. Nonsense about how he's going to take away everything that you've worked for. How much of a role do you think that played?
I mean, I think it's huge, and it's hard to quantify. Because there have been some interesting studies and reports on the number of just people try to tally up airtime devoted to certain candidates, and was there a Bernie blackout? And there is some evidence. 2016, there absolutely was a Bernie blackout. Just numerically, that's clear that they tried to bury the entire race. Pretty much everybody acknowledges that now. Probably, I wonder if even some of the, the board of the Center for American Progress would acknowledge right now. 2020, it's harder to say because Bernie did get more airtime, but I think, Anna, you hit the nail on the head. He was given more of a platform, but remorselessly, I would say, characterized as this kind of fringe candidate, as the candidate of the radical kids, basically. And it helped that 96% of the Democratic Party in Congress and elsewhere agreed with that characterization and shunned him. And so he didn't really have a lot of purchase with, kind of borderline institutional figures. And even after he won some early states, he wasn't able to kind of draw on that momentum to win institutional figures. It helped that, I think the obvious material interests of major corporate media are all staunchly in opposition to Bernie, and so even if you're giving him a little more airtime, you're absolutely shaping the framing the way he's being presented as not as a kind of as a New Deal Democrat who essentially wants to give people health care, but as someone who's pulling out harebrained schemes that are going to destroy the economy. And then the final part of that is to go back to Michael's point is, I think there is a question, and you've seen some of the debate, first salvos in this debate online already. To what extent the Sanders campaign itself and the kind of media sphere around him, in some ways, sort of played into the hands of that characterization of Sanders as a fringe candidate who, people, there's still more work on this to be done, but to what extent did the campaign itself and its own kind of internal organization, prioritize college campuses and younger voters rather than older union voters? I've seen some criticisms about empty union halls in Iowa where, whereas every college campus was blanketed. And I don't know, to be honest, how well that stuff holds up. It's very anecdotal. And then there's, the discourse criticism about did Sanders or his surrogates his larger media, his own kind of sort of shoestring media operation, I guess us, did we play into the hands of those in the mainstream media who would want to characterize Bernie as fringy and subcultural? I think personally, I guess obviously I would say that that's overblown. In terms of actually, kind of moving voters on the ground in Macomb County, Michigan, was it really because they witnessed a kind of uncouth Twitter fight between Brianna Gray Joy and Zerlina Maxwell? Like, I doubt it. But I do think the broader sense in which Bernie 2020 was more fully a candidate of the left than he was in 2016, and that limited his ceiling within the party. I think that's fair, especially in an incumbent year election with everybody focused on Trump. What's funny though is a lot of people who make that criticism, in a way, what Bernie could have done to normify himself better is probably do more of the kind of liberally stuff that we don't like, that our little set doesn't like. That is, he could have spent more time denouncing Trump's kind of procedural, crimes and blunders. He could have done, maybe he didn't have to go hard on Russia, but he could have done more on just the malfeasance of Donald Trump as this kind of exceptional figure. He did a little more than that in 2016, but he was blown out of the water that was Biden's whole campaign. And that worked alongside the media. So I don't know where Bernie really could have done about that, in the broader picture in 2020.
Yeah, we'll get to Biden in a minute, but I want to follow up on that because I think you're right, and mainly right that Bernie, that somehow the campaign did become much more clearly of the quote unquote left than it was in 2016. And that posed serious problems, and I think that even just the way of them saying, like, of course in 2020 the Bernie coalition needed to expand, and of course it needed to reach out, but don't say, like, don't throw the people that you already had under the bus, basically. So, like, even the rhetoric of, like, yeah, it was too white, too male, like, no, say you're going to expand outward. Of course you already want who's on board with you. I think there was a lot of tactical mistakes that way, both substantively and symbolically, that played into, a lot of just nonsense, and also people who are, going to be bad faith about Bernie no matter what, obviously. And I wonder, though, you could be right that the sort of more, but I think even there's a difference between normie stuff on Trump specifically and this kind of like broader language. And again, I'll be self-accountable here too. I would love if America could have a much more honest conversation about Fidel Castro. And obviously I don't believe in demonizing Castro, but was that a productive conversation for him to be having the last couple of weeks? Obviously not. That's just, even if it only affects things at the margins, these things are determined at the margins, and obviously that wasn't helpful. So I wonder if there was a way, and I think where you maybe could have gone after Biden from the beginning, and maybe it could be useful for us moving forward, of saying, like, hey, I'm definitely the guy, look, I am the person who wants single payer. I do want to complete the New Deal, but of course I think Trump is terrible and blah, 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 blah. And maybe actually say I'm the safer one to do it, and try to make that argument much earlier. Because I do think ultimately there does need to be a way of saying that this stuff, these policy proposals, are not part of some type of exclusive club. They have to be in the mainstream.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and I think figuring that out has got to be, I mean, maybe the more relevant place rather than, I mean, I would love to just, I could spend a whole year, going month by month through the Sanders campaign and guessing this move and that move. I would actually love to do that. I mean, I'm a historian, so I guess the good news is I can do that for the rest of my fucking life. I could do that. I could just go back and and relive the Michigan primary in 2016 over and over and over again and just understand how this happened. And then all of the catastrophic errors of 2020. But in some ways, the real question is, what do we do going forward with this? How do we declubify? If there is a subcultural or a kind of hermetic kind of sensibility around these ideas that, I don't know, I guess I have to admit that even leaving aside some of the class analysis for a minute, certainly, I mean, it's hard to sort of figure out sometimes whether you're doing hard-nosed, populist politics in a way that actually, reaches out and over and beyond the kind of institutional opposition to a larger audience that is fed up at our corrupt and, vampiric elites, or whether you're just being a dick. And it's really hard. I find that really hard to tell with friends. And I think a lot of people who are still gettable, I'm not even talking about the sort of Warren-Bernie voter here. I'm talking about the Biden-Bernie voter. I think a lot of people, my sense is just from reading some of the reporting, even some friends in my life who were not drawn to Warren, but are kind of, okay, they're not working class, but they're not six-figure earners. They're middle class kind of, homeowner-y types who are like, yeah, I like Bernie, in their 30s, who I like Bernie, but, really, like, this other person was a jerk to me about Bernie. I think there was some of that maybe is inevitable given the way the Sanders campaign personified this fed up energy. And like, you don't want to lose that. But I think there are ways to kind of, to expand the coalition, like Michael said, without throwing anybody out of it, but saying, hey, look, we're not going to like placate to you or kind of do some sort of, rhetorical pandering that, puts you on a pedestal and crowns you the king and queen of our coalition. But yeah, you want healthcare. I know you do. I know you've said that you want this, and your small business would benefit from this, or your life would be easier if you had more paternity leave. So I mean, but you're still voting for Biden. I know you're voting for Biden because that's just like the kind of cultural place that you found yourself in. So that's my kind of classless analysis, my kind of just interpersonal analysis of this from my gut. And I do feel like there's room there. The kind of harder material intellectual question is there really room for that kind of middle class coalition to get behind and actually do the hard work necessary to build social democracy? Or is all of that politics of be nicer to your friends, Bernie bros, just even be nicer to your Biden friends? Is that just chasing a ghost when what we really need, what we desperately need most of all, is finding new inroads to this increasingly demobilized and inactive working class?
Yeah, and I think the topic of resources necessary to exercise your vote, it's just something that needs to be discussed. Because if you're a working class individual, you're trying to put food on the table for your parents, for your kids, it takes a considerable amount of time to go out and vote. It takes other resources, money in order to have access to the information that you need in order to make an informed decision. And these are, I think, topics that kind of get left out of the conversation. It isn't simply about mobilizing working class people to cast their vote. It's about doing what's necessary to change the system to make it easier for them to do it without threatening their jobs, without losing, the things they need to provide for their kids. And I think that's something, again, that gets left out of the conversation a lot. I think also there's this feeling of helplessness and, feeling powerless that needs to be addressed as well. Yes. This feeling that, simply voting has no impact, that it's not going to lead to the changes you want to see in this government. And we need to fight back against that ideology.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the latter. I have to say, I think it's, as much as we on the left talk about these material obstacles to voting, I mean, if you look at the sort of the just discrepancy between primary voting and general election voting in working class neighborhoods, in lower income neighborhoods, in poor neighborhoods, you see that there is, obviously those material circumstances are massive, and no one doubts that they're responsible for a big chunk of why people don't vote. But if you think about, why does half the population vote on a general election and something like 10 to 20% vote in a primary election? What's the deal in that community for why people don't? I think it's the second part that is on us, in effect, that in terms of building campaigns and infrastructures and kind of organizations that convince people that something like a primary election is actually where any of the action is, frankly, in lots of for lots of local races, for lots of really significant political decisions over people's lives. And I think, the simple answer is 50 years of kind of increasing inequality and kind of flattened wages and sort of, cut, austerity and, neoliberal governance, whatever, has convinced a huge number of people to look less and less for politics for the answer. And yeah, Bernie awakened some segment of those slumbering masses, but there are a lot of other pockets that I think barely were stirred by the Sanders movement, that we have to sort of accept that. And I don't know, it's not simple to, there's simple things that you could say, talking points. Oh, we organize labor. We need, community, blah, blah, blah. But I think it's not so simple, because in terms of connecting this ridiculous circus that you guys were trashing rightly today, the ridiculous circus of national politics, that all that Donald Trump press conference stuff that you were talking about, Anna, that to the extent that, somebody turns on CNN in their public housing building, or they're sitting in their trailer somewhere, and they see that, how on earth does that feel like, oh yeah, these are the people, this is the world that's going to help me, this is the world that's going to do shit for me? And to try to convince people that there are material stakes in this game that we're playing, and that those unfold at the primary election level, it's a lot of work.
Yeah, a final question from me, but it always struck me that what was kind of depressing, and I think a genuine catch-22, was that the part of Bernie's campaign that was about mobilizing new people could only happen in 2024, when he's running for re-election and people's material lives have already improved. That starting to cross some of the bridge that you're talking about is going to take place after results have actually occurred. And I do think we have to be looking, to the extent it's practical, particularly at how to revive or in any way support organized labor. But I agree. That was why Bernie was also so important, was that Bernie was the easiest, not easy, obviously, but it was the most direct path to getting some positivity back in politics and people's lives in a real, actual way, in terms of making more money and living better lives. I want to just get your thoughts briefly on this Biden article that we were talking about off air. It's this piece that came out in 2019 by Ryan Lizza in Politico. And basically, I'll just read the title here: Why Biden's Retro Inner Circle is Succeeding So Far. And essentially, this piece it's pretty comical on some level. The comedy part of me really enjoys like all of this drama of like Bernie and the revolution, or like, obviously, of course, it's going to be one of these Gen X candidates, and then like Biden just coming out with like a group of like Irish guys who've been advising him since the 80s, just being like, I'll tell you what, Jack, Joe Biden tweets too much. Boom, wins. And but I think there's a lot of truth to it, both in terms of what you were talking about earlier, in terms of just that hunt for normalcy, which is another thing that I think we discount at our own peril. But it also struck me that when you read this piece, that this third wave formula politically that goes back to the 80s of appealing to white suburbanites by moving to the extreme right and race baiting, which is what Clinton and Biden, folks like that did. And then also to certain like blue collar whites on that type of kind of cultural political grounds. But then, you know, being quite cozy with corporate America, that basically that still works. And the woke discursive stuff is great because it's for that model, because it's like, okay, like the cultural signifiers in the 90s were, you know, be an asshole to Jesse Jackson. Now it's pretend we care about, like, you know, various kind of woke signaling, but the same formula of like, there's a couple of different baskets of whites that we'll appeal to culturally, and then we'll sop up campaign donations by being just as friendly to corporate America. I think policy-wise it's harder than it used to be, but politically it seems like still works for the Democratic Party.
Yeah, look, I have to read this excerpt from the piece because I thought that it was definitely enlightening, and we're seeing it play out in real time. And I want to get your thoughts on it, Matt. So Lizzo writes, Biden's advisors came up in politics during the Reagan Revolution, when Democrats were often taught that they needed to be ideologically cautious to win. Like Biden, they are contemptuous of the revolutionary left. Like Biden, they like to think of the Democratic coalition as still anchored in the white working class. And I thought that that was such an interesting part of the piece, because what really got Biden to the finish line in the primaries was the black vote, you know, and in the meantime, you know, behind the scenes, his advisors are like, yeah, the woke stuff. That's like the window dressing stuff that we're going to do. But really, you know, the power is in, you know, the white workers, and that's what we're going to focus on. It's just so interesting to see like that disconnect, what Biden is being represented as in the media and what he's being advised to focus on behind the scenes.
Yeah, absolutely. That article, I actually didn't read that article when it came out at the time. I went back and read it kind of after Biden was the you know, presumptive nominee. And I was sort of surprised. I don't think it got a lot of, I think it came out, it's funny, I think but it came out in December of 19, Michael? Is that right? I mean, I think that was in the midst of Biden's like biggest hiccups, where no one was talking about him. People were talking about Warren or Bernie or Buttigieg or whatever. And I don't think people really were taking the kind of outlines of a Biden administration or a Biden general election campaign seriously, which in some ways made it the kind of much more honest and sort of powerful, you know, kind of look at this group to come back and read it after what happened, after how we saw the campaign played out. Yeah, because there are all sorts of these contradictions. I mean, what some people call the great awakening of white liberal voters, especially white liberal primary voters, in their attitudes about, you know, you could call it race talk to some extent. You know, identity politics. To some extent, it shows up in policy on favorability towards certain kind of very moderate measures in, you know, intending to kind of cut down on, you know, police violence or something like that. There are some concrete things, but primarily it's sort of attitudinal in terms of what's happened basically since the Obama era. And it is quite dramatic. And I think it is a real thing in terms of how the median white educated Democratic voter wants to sort of be approached, in terms of wants to cast a ballot for a Democrat being like, we are the good guys who are not racist. And that's important in a way that it wasn't important for Democratic voters in the 80s and 90s. And I think these guys are probably aware of that.
Can we make that even more explicit, Matt? That like these people were the same people in the 90s who were saying, I want to vote for a Democrat, but I'm concerned that they might not use the police to terrorize enough inner city communities because I'm freaked out about crime. And now in today's world, I have read part of a Ta-Nehisi Coates essay, and I would like to be talked to like that. And actually the policy agenda is, I mean, I'll agree with you. There's some progress in terms of criminal justice reform, but I mean, there's bizarrely some progress in criminal justice reform in the Republican Party. So policy-wise, very little departure.
Yeah, I mean, no, I agree, and it's fascinating how complete and yet sort of meaningless that shift has seemed to be so far. And yeah, it was striking at every point during the campaign when it looked like, SS Biden was running into some kind of iceberg, whether it was early on, Me Too stuff, whether it was various kinds of, under fire from candidates of color, whether it was Kamala's, that was
busing.
me moment, right? On busing, whether it was, and then all the way through, none of it. We kept, people kept predicting, this ship's going down, and it never ever did. So not only did it not go down with black voters, which is something we could talk about probably better for another show, but it didn't go down even with the kind of white educated voters who supposedly were twisted in the wind, have been changed by this discourse, who in fact still preferred the problematic candidate over not only Sanders but Warren too in most kind of educated suburban enclaves. Biden blew Warren out of the water in Massachusetts, and he won. Yeah. He won all of those. With the exception of one or two very specific neighborhoods, he won all of those collar counties in Boston. Those rich counties that are probably extremely attitudinally woke. So yeah, what is the difference in the end? I mean, for me, my big takeaway from that article was it's really wrong to expect. It's really profoundly wrong. We knew this anyway, but that underlined it. To expect in any meaningful policy concessions from Biden moving to the left. I mean, you saw the other day he announced no new taxes on anyone making $400,000. That's Bill Clinton said no new taxes on anyone making $100,000. That's the progress of the Democratic Party in the last 25 years. Is now we are the party of people who make 100. Now they are the party of people who make 100 to 400 grand. And that's troubling. I don't think that's going to change under this leadership.
Yeah. Matt Karp, thank you so much for taking the time to have this discussion with us. Everyone check out his book. He's the author of Vast Southern Empire, Slaveholders at the Helm of American Foreign Policy. Matt, I hope you come on and speak with us again in the future.
Yeah, I'm off to not tweet and to read Dante's Inferno and feel better about myself. That's my happy bedtime reading now.
That's very high level.
One canto, one circle of hell per evening. I recommend it to all your listeners out there. It's a way to feel better about yourself and the world every night before you go to bed.
You know what I like what Matt's doing there is he's showing us exactly how to reach out to the working class, broad-based American coalition by reading Dante's Inferno.
Divine comedy, baby. That's a secret. It's a secret elixir.
I love it. We all should read that, actually. I've definitely never read it. So
neither have I till now.
All right, that's awesome. All right, let's get on it. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, guys.
I guess let's take a 30-second break and we will be right back. This is Weekends with Anna and Michael.
everyone.
Welcome back. Weekends with Anna and Michael. I'm Michael.
I'm Anna. Michael, let's talk about woke Biden showing that he's not so woke after all. You want to present the story?
Well, I'll present it this way. Everybody's talking about this story. We needed to do this today because I can guarantee you that I'll be burned out on it after we do this. I'll be done with it. Joe Biden was on with Charlemagne the God, and I actually think what he was doing is, I'm sure there is fierce, serious fighting inside the Biden brain trust about who to pick as vice president. There's Klobuchar, mystifying how she's even in the mix. Some people are pushing for Warren. Some people are pushing for Whitmer. Stacey Abrams is pushing for herself. And Joe Biden, I think, clearly wants to pick Kamala Harris. And he was like, you know what? I'm going to go out and say this shit with Charlemagne, and we're going to have no choice but to pick Kamala Harris. This is Joe Biden with Charlemagne the God from, I believe it was a Breakfast Club interview on Thursday or Friday. Friday, I think. Let's check this out. I'm sure you've already seen it. Let's see it again.
Listen, you got to come see us when you come to New York, VP Biden.
I will.
It's a long way until November. We got more questions.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
It don't have nothing to do with Trump. It has to do with the fact I want something for my community. Listen, you
So let me do my normal plug. Everybody needs to read Adolph Reed. So what I found, Anna, just 3 quick impressions. One, obviously, Joe Biden is completely entitled to, the vote of African Americans. He didn't have clear answers and was extremely defensive on his prison industrial complex record. Now, but let me say 1 or 2 other things. I mean, a ton of essentialist discourse has come out on, a million takes on, women don't vote for Bernie. Black women aren't going to vote for Bernie. There is, in the sort of pop corporate infrastructure of the Democratic Party, the kind of rhetorical trope that he just used there is alluded to and promoted all the time. So, I don't know. He's a ridiculous old man. He has no subtlety. I don't exactly see how what he said is terribly different than a lot of what you hear in, certainly let's just say MSNBC world. The third thing is, electorally, that could stand in for anything else. You're on the left, you're having trouble figuring out who to vote for. Yeah, it's a 2-person choice. Now, Trump is capitalizing on it. I think we've got some good visuals, and the campaign is certainly making a calculated choice. I think a smart one to go after the African American vote. And if they cut into it 2-3%, that's a game changer. But I guess I just am. It goes without saying that it's a stupid thing to say, but I don't know. I'm just so burned out on it's the same. It's like, right, but what is the conclusion? Most people are going to go vote for Biden. Of course, he's the choice over Trump. I know people don't like to hear that, but he is, if we're talking on that level. And there's a million essentialist discourses that have said that, that have tried to erase any distinction inside the Black community itself, that have no bigger conversation on the prison system, across the board, and have, used these tropes all the time. So he's just using the tropes. Joe Biden, and he's an arrogant, foolish old man. So he's not going to he's not going to pull it off. But I don't see substantive difference from the MSNBC wokeosphere here.
Well, I think the difference is you don't have the candidate himself emphasizing how entitled he feels to a certain group's vote. And for the people who are now going after Biden on social media over what he said, and rightfully so, he isn't entitled to anyone's vote, right? So to treat any particular group as monolithic, I think is wrong. And there's something kind of perverse of regarding like an old white guy telling black voters that they have no choice and he's the person they need to vote for. It's
look it up, Jack. Look it up,
yeah,
Charla.
Okay. So what I actually wanted to bring up in response to Democratic, pundits, whatever, media types who are going after Biden now. Well, what did you expect? Because we all went through the primary. We all saw what happened. We saw what his reaction was to anyone who showed up to a campaign event and had the audacity to ask him a mildly challenging question, right? And his response was to get defensive, just like he did with Charlemagne, to act as though he's like everyone's savior and he's the best option and he has such a great record. And what I found so fascinating about that exchange is how he encouraged black voters to look at his record. Are you sure about that? You want them to look at your record? And many have. And your record is problematic to say the least, especially when it comes to the crime bill or how the bankruptcy bill disproportionately negatively impacted communities of color throughout this country. Those are issues that he refuses to take any accountability for, and he just flat out lies to the American public about his role in pushing for the type of inequality that we're experiencing in America today, which, is bad for everyone, but again, disproportionately impacts disenfranchised demographics, including Black individuals, Latinos. It's just this frustration that I feel with, hey, we all went through the primary. Where were you? Were you asleep? Because this is something that I predicted. This is something anyone who was awake and did sound analysis could have predicted. But going back to like the race issue, I think that there is some legitimacy to the argument that the Democratic Party has taken the Black vote for granted. And one thing that I don't 100%. Agree with is definitely. And, of course. Just last week, Meghan McCain was arguing that Obama and his engagement in culture wars led to Trump. And what she was trying to say there was, the race issue, he played into that. Really? He played into that? When did Obama play into racial tensions in America? I mean, he went out of his way to stay out of those debates, to stay out of those discussions. Every once in a while, he would say something incredibly mild, like what he had to say about Trayvon Martin looking as though he could have been his son. And the backlash he received was ridiculous, to say the least. But I mean, Obama would run away from any type of, real discussion about what's going on in this country and how our treatment of the Black community negatively impacts them materially, right? Like he did never talk about that.
Not only that, I have Touré Reed's book fresh in my mind. I don't know. Meghan McCain is just so disgusting. Look, Barack Obama's primary discourse was anytime it pertained, or not anytime, but a lot of times it pertained specifically to race, was to give, moralistic, racialized lectures on pants pulling up and all sorts of other absolutely racist and ludicrous tropes that were pioneered by the Republicans and by Bill Clinton and by people like Joe Biden as a way of trying to turn material deprivation, inequity, and racism into questions of personal moral conduct. And that is fundamentally racist, and it's fundamentally anti-material, and it's fundamentally ahistorical, and it's disgusting. And I just want to add, though, to everything you're saying, I agree with completely, but I think I was being, not totally facetious. I think actually him doing this absolutely does add to the likelihood of Harris being his VP. And I think, frankly, as somebody who's completely tapped out of the idea of any, we lost, this isn't going to be a good policy agenda, it's just simply a question of replacing Trump, I think Harris is definitely on the list of picks that are in the smart bracket versus the dumb bracket of possible picks. But it's just very interesting, and it goes back to, again, the complete, how non-material and non-real most of the discussion is, because you could see like some of the, the critique coming from the left and from people like rooted in materialist anti-racism and more is definitely everything you're talking about, the entitlement, how it connects with the policy sets and everything else. But there's also like this other sort of like, not what does this gaffe connect to in terms of actual policies, and then this idea that like, well, if you pick a Harris, she'll tell you not to be a jackass, not there's going to be any type of new policy portfolio. And and I think this is just like the loop we're constantly stuck in. And again, another reason why the bullshit with Bernie, it wasn't just that it was, in and of itself, it was bullshit. It was ridiculous. It wasn't, I would say it was a quadruple standard, forget a double standard. But it was the exact inverse of where we needed to go, because it was someone who in the main, and I think the numbers were crunched, that if you did Bernie's agenda, just the agenda, single payer, all of these other vital things that need to be done to build a basic decent society for everybody, because of how these things are racialized, it would be like the largest, maybe the largest redistribution of wealth in American history, in addition to all of the other vital good things it would do for all people who were, say, the 99% even, or the 80%. And that was all blown off. And then if Bernie used like the wrong sentence conjugation, this could be like a 3-day story. And it wasn't just that, it mattered during the campaign. It doesn't matter now, but it feeds into where we're at now. And I think even in terms of how we talk about this story, because it's like, if Biden's saying this is a launching point for the Democratic Party's record and its entitlement and indeed its racism, then great. If it's just, oh, this old man makes gaffes, so he needs to, pick actually someone with basically indistinguishable politics who will sort of mind him. Basically, we already had that for 8 years. That was actually Obama and Biden. Biden's picked to reassure uncomfortable suburbanite white people, don't worry about it. And then on the other hand, he actually has to listen to his boss and be less of a jackass. And now we'll just do that, except with the roles reversed. So if it isn't a launching point for a serious discussion, it just becomes like another cycle of kind of meaningless outrage that isn't going to get us anywhere.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you on that. And, some of the takes, and like, it's an uncomfortable topic to comment on as a white woman. I'm just keeping it real, because
it's super
I
comfortable as a white man. We comment on everything.
Yeah, but like, you get what I'm saying? Like,
yeah,
I'm not part of a community that has like a fundamentally different life experience, and they have demands that I think in a lot of cases make sense. And then there are demands where I just think, I don't know if this is really going to serve you as much as you think it is. So for instance, I think that there are women of color, Black women specifically, who would be fantastic in a Biden administration if you want representation, and people who are going to like balance out, I think, Biden's worst characteristics, right? So I know that this is unrealistic. It's not going to happen. But, if you really actually wanted to appeal to progressive voters, you could have a Nina Turner. You could have a Barbara Lee. There are incredible Black politicians out there who I would love to see represented in the federal government. But instead, I see all of this like just window dressing stuff that drives me crazy. And it's very similar to what we experienced with Hillary Clinton. It's like, we got to elect a woman. Okay, great. I agree with that. But just any woman, right? And you're seeing the same thing play out with Black representation within Biden's administration, right? We need to have a Black VP pick. We need to have a Black Supreme Court justice nomination. I'm okay with that. I just want to make sure that we have a discussion about what the candidates for these positions represent and whether or not they're actually going to do something to fundamentally change how this system has further disenfranchised the very group that they're supposed to be representing.
Well, yeah, of course. But again, this takes us back to our weekly, everybody needs to read Adolph Reed. And, that sort of, representation in the context of capitalism is never going to get us to any of those core policy sets for problem solving. That's just an objective truth. And it also does not undermine, obviously, it's a pluralistic, diverse society. And that's one of the best things about America. Obviously, it needs to be represented in politics. But as a complete representational substitution for policy, we already know the results of that. And we also know that in neoliberal politics, they could care less about, it's totally fine to have obscene poverty from every background. And it's fine to have a 1% that controls a vast majority of the resources. It just needs to be proportionally correct. That's the be all end all of their politics. And that's why it's fundamentally not our politics. But at any rate, Biden still comfortable leads in the polls. So we'll see. I'm a look. You know what? We need to not have Trump. And if we're not going to have Bernie, at least let's have somebody else that's entertaining.
It's funny that you find
that's
it
how
entertaining.
Cynical I am.
I find it depressing because,
of course it's depressing.
There's a difference. There's a difference between Trump's mental decline and Biden's mental decline. Like, Trump somehow is able to sell it as I'm mentally sharp, but I'm entertaining and incredibly stupid. Whereas Biden, it's just painful. It hurts to watch it. But lately he's been pretty okay in his interviews. I feel like he's been napping a lot lately. He's feeling a little more energized. He's not losing his train of thought as much, which is good. More naps, please.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm rested up. Ha yeah. Who y'all gonna vote for? Ha 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 ha. He rests up. Reminds us what an asshole he is. So guys, I don't know if what I should have said in the beginning, and this is my mistake, is that we will be taking super chat questions because that is how the channel gets helped. So I'm not sure if we do have any of those. We might have to wait for questions for next week, but we will definitely do them next week. We will take your super chat questions. Meanwhile, make sure you hit like, make sure you hit subscribe. Make sure you watch all of the stay-at-home episodes. Just an incredible political education here. I just watched the one on A. Philip Randolph. I think that might be the most important figure that actually we could study right now in America, just across the board. But as always, thank you, Kale. Thank you, Jacobin crew. And Anna, thank you. It's awesome doing this show with you.
Thank you. I absolutely love it.
All right, folks. We'll see you next week.